I used to be a diving guide in Bali, Indonesia. Groups could reserve me for a relaxed lesson or for about a week of submersion, where they could gain a temporary diving permit. So this one party books me. They're a varied assembly in their early 20s. Partners and companions, privileged individuals aplenty, but I'm not one to pass judgment. Our initial activity was underwater strolling. Now, I had never tried underwater walking since it was fairly new then, but I'm eager to attempt it. So we crowd into small boats and take a brief journey out toward the main vessel. Now, this is just a nautical term for a larger craft that smaller ones like ours can operate from. But we go a step further to justify this by having spray painted one of those enormous gray extraterrestrial heads onto the hull. It looked fantastic, and naturally the youngsters loved it. Underwater walking itself was akin to the time I did snuba, scuba plus snorkeling equals snuba, in the Caribbean, in that the oxygen cylinders float up on the water's surface instead of being on the diver's back. The other significant contrast to standard diving is that instead of having a scuba mask to respire through, we had these big, old sci-fi looking helmets on. I mean, they looked like they were props from that old Lost in Space program that used to be on television. I went first, and the procedure was quite simple. I held onto the ladder with most of my body in the water. They placed a small foam rubber ring on my head to cushion the helmet, and then they finally put the helmet on. The instant it was on my body, it felt like its weight was forcing me to the seabed. It was rather frightening because I descended quite rapidly, which caused the pressure to build up swiftly. I made sure to swallow and yawn frequently to counteract the effects of the pressure, and I was fine. Also, I could never really get a full breath of air because as I inhaled thinly, the helmet began to create a vacuum, and I would have to pause to let it fill with more air. Then, two members of the mixed group of teenagers followed suit before a scuba diving man came down to be our leader. He handed all of us a piece of bread in a plastic bag, which drew all the fish to us. That was a lot of fun watching otherwise shy fish practically swarming us. There were metal guiding handrails on the ocean floor, which I followed. The two kids followed behind me. It was very difficult to walk because the current was surprisingly strong, and the helmets were quite heavy. We found it all incredibly enjoyable, though. I had been diving for years, and even to me it was a novelty. As I breathed, there was a constant loud buzzing sound as the water put pressure on the oxygen tube. It was kind of irritating, but it meant that it was getting air, which was obviously good. That's why it was so scary when the sound suddenly ceased. I was bewildered, but it quickly came back on after about 2 or 3 seconds and I could breathe again. It happened one more time, and again it returned very quickly. I explained it to myself by assuming that my tank had run out and they were switching it to a different one. No big deal. I didn't understand how they would deplete so quickly, but I didn't dwell on it too much. It soon came back on and I could breathe, so no big deal. After about 10 minutes or so, I'm guessing, I have no idea how long we were down there, the guide points at me and indicates that he wants me to climb over the railing. I was very confused, but I did it after he made it very clear that that was what he wanted. It was kind of hard to see any peripherals out of the mass, so it was easy to get disoriented. I glanced back behind me to make sure that the teenagers saw where I went and didn't get lost. We made eye contact, so I assumed Vaiwanilali. We were all good and then turned back around to follow the guide. He had me walking in a very narrow path between two corals, so I went very slowly to make sure that I didn't cut my legs up on them. It was hard due to the strong underwater current, my unwieldy helmets, and an occasional tug by the air tube as I pulled it taut. As I reached the guide, my air stopped again. I figured it was no big deal like the previous 2 times and continued on. I followed him for a bit, but it still didn't come on. 5 seconds without oxygen, then 10. I started to get confused. Was this some kind of joke? If so, it wasn't funny at all, at 15 seconds. I thought to myself, don't panic. They always tell you not to panic, but I panicked. I started taking quicker and quicker breaths, but I forced myself to stop that. Thanks to previous training, I knew that that was the worst thing I could do. I spun around to the guide and started pounding my fist on my chest. That was the sign for, I can't breathe. He seemed to notice and started walking away. I could only hope that he was taking me to the boat. I thought maybe I should just try and shrug off the helmet and swim to the surface. I didn't know if I had enough air to make it. I didn't know if the boat was above me. I didn't want to hit my head. I didn't know if I could actually shrug it off, and I didn't want to get the bends, so I figured it wouldn't be a good idea. 30 seconds. I started to notice that I was getting less and less oxygen with each breath. Water was starting to seep into my helmet. I had to look up to breathe with the little air that I had. I grabbed hold of the guide's arm so that I wouldn't lose him, and also so that he would understand the seriousness of the situation. I gave him quite the death grip. 40 seconds without oxygen. My lungs ached for air. I saw the ladder of the boat. I knew that all I had to do was make it there, and I would be okay. I must have gotten some sort of adrenaline rush with the renewed hope because I almost forgot about my lack of air. I fumbled for the ladder for a few seconds. It was hard to tell distances through the helmet because it had a bit of a magnifying aspect to it before I grabbed it and started pulling myself up. As I broke the surface, air came rushing back into my helmet, and I took a nice deep breath. Breathing had never felt better. It was definitely the scariest experience of my life, and I absolutely would not recommend underwater walking to anyone. Living on the Mississippi coast, I've been on and around the water my entire existence. I have countless tales of wild experiences and strange occurrences while being on the water. Most involve dealing with severe weather, such as lightning storms, water funnels, or turbulent seas. Those can be awesomely terrifying, but the most bizarre things I've witnessed have happened while employed on fishing charter vessels. But the one job that always remains with me and the one I would consider the biggest eye-opener occurred back in 2010 when the Deepwater Horizon oil platform exploded and began discharging oil into the Gulf of Mexico. BP, after realizing to some degree how extensive the spill was, began a program that allowed owners of boats to register and participate in the cleanup efforts along the shoreline. Those who were fortunate enough to be accepted into the program sometimes took advantage of an incredible chance to do something beneficial for the environment and earned significant money from it while simultaneously preventing others from getting into the program who would have actually helped. That's something to mention later, but overall it's a story for another discussion. So, given that the water that I had basically grown up on was being ruined, I couldn't just sit back and do nothing. I went and got hazmat certified. Then, through certain contacts, I first started working on a 127-foot charter boat that would normally go out to the Chandeleur Islands, located off the Louisiana coast, for several days and nights, and drop skiffs in the water where clients were guided around the islands to fish. Also, I would suggest if anyone has the opportunity to go out to these islands, please do it. It's absolutely incredible there, and the fishing is always superb. Anyway, back to the story. I was working on this boat for about 2 weeks before I was transferred to an offshore division that consisted of about a dozen boats. These boats were strictly personal fishing and commercial charter boats, with the largest being 57 feet.